Dark and Darker, man, absolutely one of the more pleasant surprises in all of gaming over these past 12 months. The title first appeared on Steam back in June of last year, and in the subsequent months ran alpha testing that quickly garnered a ton of attention, culminating in February of this year with a test that peaked at nearly 100,000 concurrent users. 100,000 people all playing simultaneously for an alpha of an unknown game from a brand new developer. Reaching those kind of numbers were really impressive. Quite the feat, and it happened for a good reason, because Dark and Darker was really, really good. The game took the basic loop of the extraction shooter genre, but replaced the guns and Kevlar in a military setting with swords and magic in a fantasy setting. For me, I'll say Dark and Darker, I think, just really delivered on that feeling of a dungeon diving adventure, tasking you with navigating through dark dungeons full of surprises, all sorts of deadly traps and creatures, along with other players who are eager to kill you and steal all of your stuff. Your goal was simply to survive, collect as much loot as you could, and then try to escape, with all of the variables and everything that could go wrong going wrong, making for a really entertaining and thrilling experience. The change of setting aside, the game just seemed to strike all of the right balances to create something that felt fresh, new, and novel, which, as we all know, can be really hard to come by. But anyway, yes, Dark and Darker was really fun. A lot of people were really enjoying it. I myself had a blast with each and every playtest and was looking forward to its eventual upcoming release, which was slated for some time this year. But then, much like can happen in the game itself, everything went very south very quickly. In February, around the same time their record high player count alpha test took place, reports started popping up. We started seeing articles and Reddit threads online about Nexon claiming that Dark and Darker was full of stolen assets and code, or was at best a complete ripoff of a game that they had in development. The reason for these claims being that Iron Mace's co-founder was a former Nexon employee who up until the year prior was working on a game code-named P3. Now, P3 was pretty much identical in its structure, in the systems and mechanics to what we saw with Dark and Darker. It was a fantasy extraction looter, dungeon diving game. The structure, the way the game was set up, what you did, how it all played out, P3 and Dark and Darker were very similar games. So after leaving Nexon and forming Iron Mace Studio, while also taking some members of Nexon's P3 development team with him, they developed and launched Dark and Darker on Steam, and as just covered, it quickly became quite successful. And that success, of course, would likely mean loads of money when Dark and Darker eventually released. And so Nexon took notice, and they were not too thrilled. In turn, they filed a DMCA claim, resulting in Dark and Darker being removed from Steam. They launched investigations, legal investigations, with the Korean police raiding Iron Mace Studios at one point, going into their offices and seizing equipment and hard drive. Nexon then also filed both criminal and civil lawsuits, both of which, as of today, are still currently in progress. So Nexon has a criminal case in Korea against Iron Mace's co-founder, Mr. Choi, as well as a civil case here in the US against Iron Mace Studios, attempting to prevent them from distributing the game on Steam or any other platform here in the West. The whole thing was just a massive mess. Now, in those first few weeks and months after these reports started popping up, we saw a ton of back and forth he said, she said reporting, but now that the dust has settled several months later, it seems pretty clear the general timeline of what happened. So some of the people who were working at Nexon on Project P3, they were not all too happy with how the game's development was going. They didn't like Nexon's approach or many of the decisions that were being made. Specifically, they weren't too keen on their plans for monetizing P3. However, they did like the idea of a fantasy extraction game. They thought, hey, this is pretty good. We like what we're making. We just don't like what Nexon is doing. So they quit Nexon, form Iron Mace Studios, get some other people to also quit Nexon and join them, and then they started making their own version. That game, the thing that they came up with, Dark and Darker, as just recently mentioned, came to Steam, had the alpha tests, and those alpha test received a resoundingly positive reception. Just lots of people were playing, people were really excited about the game and really enjoying the game. Now, what's still up in the air as of this moment is how much, if any, code from P3 was used to start Dark and Darker's development. Of course, Iron Mace Studios says 0%, but Nexon thinks otherwise. In addition to the code, were any of P3 assets used to make Dark and Darker? Iron Mace once again says no. They state that all of the game's assets are either from the Unreal Engine marketplace or were handcrafted in-house. While Nexon, on the other hand, thinks that they've got proof about multiple stolen assets from P3 being used in Dark and Darker. All of this debate is still to be settled in the Korean courts for the criminal case, with Nexon trying to prove that Mr. Choi stole their stuff, be that code, be that assets, or quote, trade secrets, which basically means just taking the concept of the game, the idea of the game, all of the things that went into the game's development, taking that and then turning around and making your own project instead of going along with what they were making. And as a result of these apparent thefts, Nexon is looking for the resulting criminal consequences for Mr. Choi, with Mr. Choi's defense being, we didn't steal any code, we didn't steal any assets, sure the games are in the same genre, but who cares? On top of that, Nexon canceled the development, they stopped making P3, so that game apparently isn't even ever going to see the light of day anyway. So they could make the argument that, hey, Nexon isn't even releasing P3, so Dark and Darker isn't competing with anything that they're doing as of yet. And again, on top of that criminal case, there is also the ongoing civil suit here in the US, where Nexon is trying to prevent Iron Mace Studios from distributing Dark and Darker in the West. In the midst of all of this, Iron Mace, at least publicly, doesn't seem to give a damn. They've said, hey, don't worry gamers, none of this is affecting development, we are still working on the game. In fact, they've gone as far, after all of this stuff started kicking up and the lawsuits started going out and arrest warrants and Korean police searching their offices, in the midst of everything happening, Iron Mace started running additional playtests. In April, they held their 5th test for Dark and Darker. However, since the game was no longer available on Steam, they opened it up to be downloaded via torrent instead. Now, the rollout of this was a bit messy, with both Discord and Twitter removing the official announcement post due to their policies of not allowing links to torrents on these services. But ultimately, the test did go live and it was successful, peaking at over 80,000 players, which for a torrent in 2023, that is nuts. Like, people don't know how to use torrents nowadays. The people who used to torrent stuff probably forgot. All the young kids probably don't even know what a torrent is. So it's crazy that they torrented a test that peaked at over 80,000 players. That just blows my mind. And the test came with a ton of additions as well, with them adding 2 brand new maps, a new class, new weapons and features, along with a bunch of bug fixes and quality of life improvements. All around, this 5th test of Dark and Darker was very successful. A lot of people played it, and it clearly showed that Iron Mace was still working on the game in spite of everything that was going on. Now, all of this up until this point is as of last April. Since then, there have been a few updates. On the development side, Iron Mace is still plugging away. In fact, in the past 2 months, they have posted several new videos showcasing a lot of new stuff. They showed a brand new class, the Warlock, who casts curses that does things like reducing enemy stats or dealing damage over time. There's one that would sacrifice health for increased strength. All around, it seems like a pretty good support and offensive class. They also had map updates for both the ruins and the goblin caves. There were more new weapons added, like the Bard now can play drums as a new weapon, and there were a few other updated clips just showing us some more gameplay, a few more rounds, a few different scenarios, things like that. All in all, clearly development of the game is moving along nicely. Legally, though, things continue to be messy. There have been developments in both the criminal and civil cases. Plenty of paperwork filed, a lot of that pre-court date back and forth between the prosecution and the defense. Just last week, there was actually an arrest warrant filed for Mr. Choi in Korea. However, that has since been dismissed by a judge, so it looks like Mr. Choi is safe from jail time as of now. And then just as of yesterday, Iron Mace posted this massive 25-page response to the civil case that's ongoing here in the US. So the wheels are still churning on all fronts when it comes to the legal fight between Nexon and Mr. Choi, as well as Nexon Nexon and Iron Man Studios. No definitive conclusions one way or the other as of now, though. We simply don't know what is going to happen, how either the criminal case against Mr. Choi or the civil case against Iron Mace here in the States. We don't know how either one of these are going to turn out, and the results of both of these cases will have a massive impact on whether or not we will get to eventually play Dark and Darker, whether or not they will be legally able to distribute this game. What we do know is that Iron Mace is still clearly working on the game. They hope to win their legal battles, obviously, and with the goal of releasing Dark and Darker. And I would say we hope so too. And I say we because one thing that's been pretty clear over these past 8 or so months of this debacle is what side the gamers are on between Nexon and Iron Mace. And it's Iron Mace all the way. There has just been a ton of community goodwill across the board for Iron Mace Studios, largely due to this just being a good game. People tried it, they really enjoyed playing it, and they would like to continue playing it. So selfishly, yes, many people just want to see Iron Mace win so that they can release Dark and Darker and we can keep playing. But also on top of that, I think part of the sentiment around all of this, the legal proceedings and the development of this game, boils down to the attitude of the development studio. Iron Mace is very much so positioning themselves as the underdog, the David to Nexon's Goliath, which they are. They're an indie studio. However much funding they have or don't have, they are very small fries when compared to the massive conglomerate that is Nexon. Now, in fact, going as far as to, in the About Us section on their website, to really take this stance and solidify it. It says here, "We are a merry band of veteran game developers disillusioned by the exploitative and greedy practices we once helped create. We are experts who have worked on many of the biggest hits in Korea. We've seen firsthand how corporate game companies sell their soul for the easy payday. We are disappointed to see them doubling down on more and more exploitative practices, becoming more like casinos instead of bringing joy to gamers." What self-respected gamer is going to argue with that? I mean, that is quite the statement, and you know, words are one thing, actions are another. Dark and Darker hasn't released. We don't really know for sure what their final monetization method is going to be, how much, if any, predatory microtransactions will be thrown in there. But boy, that is quite the statement, and it's hard to look at that and be like, boy, I really side with Nexon, especially when Nexon is very much so the embodiment of the thing that they say they're fighting against, with the predatory monetization, with the games that feel a lot more like casinos that are just reaching for your wallet and trying to keep you paying and playing, but not really so much interested in delivering a truly authentic, good old-fashioned video game that you play because it's fun to play, rather just trying to make something that's addictive and you play because your lizard brain keeps you playing. So yeah, suffice it to say, people are in support of Iron Mace. This is where a lot of the rallying cry from the community online. Honestly, I don't even know why I have to try to explain this. Who's out there waving the flag for Nexon, right? I suppose though, like when it comes to right and wrong, you know, if they made this game off of the back of stolen code and stolen assets, that is certainly an issue. It would be far more ideal if Dark and Darker from scratch was made with brand new fresh code, no stolen assets. The trade secret side of things, I understand that like legally Nexon might have some grounds when it comes to that. I think like, I don't know, philosophically, I don't get, you know how many of every type of genre of game exist, and the fact that Nexon isn't even releasing P3, they've halted development. Whatever, Nexon, like take a hike, seriously. Like this is a cool genre of game. This is something that people after getting their hands on clearly really enjoyed, and we want to keep on playing it. Just seems like sour grapes in this situation because yeah, they canceled P3. They could have continued development. I know part of the argument for Nexon canceling P3 comes down to the fact that Mr. Choi and company left the game and started developing their own thing, and they were pretty high up in the development of P3, but Nexon's big enough that they could have found more people to continue supporting the project if they saw merit in it. They clearly did not place their chips there, and now it just looks like after the success of these alpha playtests for Dark and Darker, they're just upset that they aren't the ones releasing it, and they're not the ones monetizing and cashing out on it. And we all know how a Nexon version of Dark and Darker would have turned out. It would have been absolutely full of microtransactions, like just all the way up to the teeth. Like, so it's hard to, it's very hard to feel bad for them in this situation. even if they do have a legal ground to stand on. But it doesn't really matter how I feel or how the gamers feel, because yes, a lot of this is going to boil down to how the civil case turns out in the States and how that legal case turns out in Korea. Although I do believe that the criminal case against Mr. Choi, even if that is successful for Nexon, I don't believe that halts development of Dark and Darker. It is really the civil case in the US, because it is the civil case in the US that is against Iron Man Studios. The criminal case is just against one person in Korea. Well, we'll have to see how this all plays out. It is, again, still up in the air. When it comes to what's next with Dark and Darker, well, it's a whole lot of rumor and speculation. You know, you've got people out there saying that the game is going to be back on Steam, launching any day now. Yeah, okay. Part of this is fueled by the fact that recently the game got a PEGI 16 rating. PEGI is the European content rating system for games, the US equivalent of this being the ESRB, which, mind you, ESRB still has not rated Dark and Darker, so there is that. And the original release window for Dark and Darker was slated for Q4 2023, although at this point that seems pretty much impossible given these ongoing legal battles and how we are expecting these to take at least a few more months to conclude. So really, at this point, we are just in limbo until this stuff gets resolved, which does suck for people like myself who like Dark and Darker and would like to continue playing it. But that is just the fact of the matter. We are just sitting here waiting for this stuff to finish, waiting for the game to be legally allowed to be distributed here in the West or otherwise. When talking about this, I've looked around like curious, you know, Dark and Darker turned out really awesome, very cool concept. Is anyone else making something like this? And there are apparently some alternatives. Someone pointed me to this game Dungeon Stalkers.
One day, an enormous dungeon emerged in between two countries. A huge dungeon created by a mysterious witch.
I'm not useless. I'm...
My daughter has gone into the dungeon. I need to save her. She's probably trembling in the dark. What happened in this dungeon?
Gotta say, not looking really good. Now, so yes, I do hope that Dark and Darker succeeds. I hope that Iron Man Studios wins their case. They win the civil case here in the States. They're allowed to continue development and allowed to publish the game here in the West. Other than that, I also just hope that developers take this as a sign that there is a thirst for this kind of game. I guess kind of similar to the whole Day Before fiasco with all of the excitement behind this idea of a new survival zombie MMO. Looks like the Day Before isn't going to be that. I hope new developers, other developers, take the opportunity to make a new zombie survival MMO, because clearly there's a thirst for it. And similarly, clearly there is a thirst for a dungeon diving loot extraction game that's fantasy based instead of being military shooter based. There's a thirst for this. Dark and Darker proved, if done well, people will really enjoy it. And I'm hoping we see more games developed. I want Dark and Darker to come through. I think this is a good game in and of itself, but I'd also like to see more developers take a crack at the genre, because yeah, it's pretty darn fun when done right. So there you go. That is it. An update for Dark and Darker, everything that's happened over these past 12 or so months. Thank you for watching. I will keep you updated as more major involvements come through with this, and hopefully when the game eventually comes back to Steam, right? That's what we're hoping for. We'll see though. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed the vid, and I'll see you next time. Take it easy.